All right, well today we're gonna be going over this two-part mold. Well, we have half of it done already, but we're gonna go over how to actually finish this up and what we did to get to this point. This is just a remote control, one of the little Roku remotes. We're just trying a little experiment, seeing if we can get rid of the bottom 4 buttons on it, because there's not really any place on the remote to hold it, so anytime you pick it up, you'll accidentally hit one of the buttons. And we didn't use any of the buttons at the bottom, so we're trying to see if we could just make a casting of just the face shield, but without the any of the holes for the buttons. All right, now typically when you're doing a two-part mold, you don't want to take it out of the box, but in order to get all this clay off, it's a lot easier. And being a square piece, I'm not really worried if silicone drips down the edges, because I could just cut it out. So we laid down some clay in order to block off the sides so we can make our part line for the two parts. It also allows us to block off the holes for where the buttons were. So all we have to do now is just get this carefully off. We want to try to keep the part still stuck to the silicone. We don't want it to separate, because then you end up with air bubbles underneath where it once was. So to get the cleanest line, you want it to stay inside that silicone until you take it out for the last time. But luckily the way we did this, we made it so that the bottom half was the first side that we did, which is going to have the most holding force, because it has all of the ribs and everything in it, where this top is just smooth. So now this is all just going to be one flat piece. The only harder part I see here is because since this is Bondo, it's softer than the plastic. So when we sanded it down, there might be some dishing in here from where this sanded away a little faster than the plastic. We just had these little nuts in here as it's to index it into these points, so that when we do our second half, it'll lock into place when we put it on top. Yeah, one of the nice things, we use Monster Clay now for this stuff. We used to use this unnamed lighter tan clay that was very sticky, and it liked to break apart and stick to anything. Whereas this Monster Clay stuff is a lot more rigid, and it doesn't stick very well, which is good because you don't want to have to constantly peel stuff off these parts. When it's cold, it's a lot harder and it comes off a lot nicer. When it's warmed up, it'll be a lot softer and it'll be a lot easier to control. So that's good for making the mold. Then when you're demolding it, it's nice and rigid, so it comes off a lot better. But it left a lot of little bits on this one for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why. It might have just been the way I peeled it apart. All right, now one of the most important things when you're doing this is you need a release agent. Silicone sticks to nothing except silicone. It will fuse itself to any silicone it touches, so if you want to be able to actually separate this mold ever again, you have to use a release agent. This is basically just a brush-on liquid, sort of like a wax when it dries, making a nice barrier between the two silicones. That way it separates nice and easily. Alright, that should be good. We're going to let that dry for about 5 minutes while we prepare other things. Then we have to put on a second coat just to really make sure the stuff doesn't stick together. Because if both sides do stick together, it's going to be a nightmare trying to get this thing apart. That being said, if you have a clear enough silicone, it is a common practice to encase the entire thing in a clear silicone and then cutting the part out if it's simple enough. That gives you a much sharper parting line, and if you have complex geometry, it's easier to cut it out than try to set up the clay so you have a full parting line. Alright, so let that dry for a bit, and we're going to set up our second set of silicone and our mold box. So there's a little bit of a cut in here to show which ones go with which, because I had to straighten the edges on our mill to make sure this is a nice square corner. I use those little indicators to show which ones were cut together. So this one will go right here. This is also 1:1 mix ratio. So starting off at 0 there. You have to mix these in the can first. 11.8 ounces of part B. Zero that out. Alright, now we're going to throw it in the vacuum chamber. You always want to pour from one corner, the lowest corner, let it sort of work its way over. High and slow sort of helps get the bubbles out of the stream as it's stretching out and going down like that. It sort of pops any little bubbles that are stuck in there. Though all the smallest ones will still stay. Good. Since this is the bucket that I mixed it in, I don't want to scrape the sides, otherwise I could end up with some uncured silicone at the top. Alright, now we just have to wait for that to dry for 75 minutes. So it's been 75 minutes, so now we're just going to demold our part, see how everything turned out. Go, perfect. You can see it was sticking a little bit on the very tips, but it did not fully stick to it, which is the important part. Here's our part, and now you can see the other end of the Bondo. Now, this is a little dirty. We're gonna do something called a clear out pour. That is when you pour in your silicone or your material in for the first time, and the point of it is to pick up any of these little specks of dirt, any of the clay that got in places where it wasn't supposed to go, and that pulls it all out so you don't end up in your final pour. But since we are using a pure black plastic, it's probably not going to matter. So if we do this first pour and it turns out bad, that will be our clear out pour. If not, then we will just use it as our final piece. But the first things first is we need to get holes in here. So I'm going to clean this up a little bit, and then I'll show you how we put in our vents and our pouring spout. So when we're drilling these vent holes, what you want to look at on here is we're going to be pouring from this end because this is our finished side. We don't want there to be any parts that have to get cut off of this because it's going to be much harder to finish if you do that. So we're going to pour from this end, and what we're going to do is try to get any of these high spots, like these screw mounts all over here, all these posts. We're going to try to drill holes so that when we pour the silicone in, it has somewhere for the air to go. So you're going to look at whatever the high point is going to be the points where air is going to try to bubble up. So we're going to have lots of little holes in this, and instead of casting it with something in place like a bunch of toothpicks glued in place to actually make those vents, what we're going to use are these little brass tubes. Now you can get these at most hardware stores. I get these at Ace because they have that rack that has a bunch of different sizes of these, and they're nice and cheap. I just put these on a sander on a drill and just taper those edges enough. When you drill into here, it'll actually cut through the silicone. If you try to use a regular drill bit in silicone, it's just going to push the silicone aside and not actually make a clean hole. This will actually cut out a solid hole the size of that tapered bit right there. So we're going to get one the right length, and we are going to start drilling some holes. Our pouring spout's going to be right in here. You're going to want to pour into the low spot. So we're going to drill our holes into these posts because they're our highest points. All the way through to the other side. If you put some wax on this, it'll actually help it go through a lot cleaner, and it won't tug the silicone as much. So I'm just going to run this in the buffer real quick. So now we're just going to focus on getting these holes where all these little ridges are. This will help it pour a lot smoother and have a lot less air bubbles. And at the top here, just looking for any of these, the highest points that you can see in here are the ones that you want to aim for the most. Now what a lot of people do is they will do a pour first before they put any of their vents in, and they will take their part out and look for any bubbles in the part and use those as guides to where they're going to put their vents. But I already know where we're going to need vents, which we're definitely going to need them in these higher bits and all these edges around here. So I'm going to get whatever I can in there, and in the first pour, if there's anything that didn't get filled, then I could use that as a guide for where to put more of them. Now I'm just going to drill the pouring spout. I'm going to probably pour right into here. So it's pour into there, that way it goes straight in, out, and then, oh no, it has a step there. So like I said, you always want to go for the lowest areas, because remember, you're doing the opposite of this when you're pouring in. So it's pouring in, so this area here is actually the high point in there. It's because you can feel the silicone mold's going to hit there, and then it's going to go downhill to all the other parts. So that's where you want to start it. We'll use a nice thick block here so that after I drill through here, I can use a knife and taper the end to actually fit a funnel. That actually did a really, really poor job. I think I need to sharpen this. So I will be right back. All right, if you can make out this little hole here, I'm not sure if you can see it on the camera, but that's what happens if you use a bit that's not sharp. Because what it's going to be doing then is just basically, think of like a needle going in, and where it's just pushing the material out of the way instead of actually cutting it. So I went ahead and sharpened this bit a bit more, and now I'm going to try and see if it makes a cleaner cut. And yeah, you could definitely tell because you could see the silicone inside of the end of the cutter. There we go. That's what you're looking to get. But now we could use a knife and widen out that hole a little bit. That's going to be our pouring spout. And once all of this goes back together, so that's, you can see here all these little indexing points are meant to stick together. As you can see, it locks together pretty well. It doesn't slide out. All right, now we're gonna just clean this up a bit, get rid of some of this flashing, and we'll be right back. This is what we were using. We're gonna be using Smoothcast Onyx Fast with a 2.5 minute pot life, so we're gonna have to be working really quick. This stuff is, so far, the only way I've ever managed to get fully black plastic. I've tried it with Simpact, I've tried it with Smoothcast 120, I think. But they're white plastics, and some are off-white plastics. But because they have a color to them, no matter how much black dye I added, I always end up with just a dark gray. But there might be something I'm doing wrong, so the easiest method now is just using Onyx, because this is an already black plastic. So this is a pretty small part. Now you can measure volume just by using your part, submerging it in a measuring cup filled with water, and then just watching where the level goes to after you put your part in. That's a pretty easy way of determining volume. But I mean, we always want to have a little bit extra when we're pouring in instead of the exact amount, so we're just going to wing it. So I'm thinking 2 ounces of each should be enough. Now this is 1-to-1 if you're mixing it just by volume, but if you're checking by weight, it's 120 to 100. So there's an extra 20% for part A. So we're just going to be doing it by volume. Alright, so I'm going to degas these real quick and I'll be right back. I forgot to mention that we did put rubber bands around these just to help keep it shut. As long as you use only a few of them and they're not the really high strength ones, you don't have to worry about deforming anything. Plus this is a very thick mold, so we're not really too worried. The void in the middle is very thin because it's just this small little thin part. So it shouldn't really deform much just from a few rubber bands. Now once these two combine together, then we have only 2.5 minutes to get it in there before it solidifies. So let's get started. You want to try to minimize bubbles when you're mixing these. So we don't want to go too fast, but we also don't want to be too slow with how fast this stuff cures. Alright, that should hopefully be enough. We're going to use a syringe to inject it in because this is a thin part, so it's going to be difficult to get it in any other way. Alright, perfect. Let's get it in the pressure chamber. 10 minutes later, should be done. Alright, so you see it's still a little bit soft. I'm just going to let it cure the rest of the way. Just sitting out here. The guidelines on the plastics will tell you its demold time is only 10 minutes, but you gotta remember that with thinner parts, they'll stay softer for a lot longer. So if you don't want to deform, you're probably gonna have to leave it in for a lot longer. But I wanted to take it out so I could inspect all of the sides of it, make sure that there's no air bubbles anywhere, and see where I need to make changes, because this was mostly a clear out pour. So I can definitely see in some areas it's lifted up because of how I opened it, which again, I'm not too worried about. We're just trying to make sure that everything is clear. But one thing I wanted to show here is you can see the surface here, it's almost identical to the surface finish of the original. Well, it is identical to the surface finish, but the coloring is pretty much perfect. So it was definitely a good choice using that Onyx stuff. But we'll just let it cure for a little bit longer just so I don't tear out any of the little parts there. And then we'll check the underside to see where we need to fix. We could already see that there's a little tiny bubble there. That's an easy enough fix. That's just putting another vent line there. You see a lot of waviness from, again, from how I was opening it up. You want to let this sit for probably, it says 10 minutes, but you're probably going to want it to sit for like 30 or 45 or so, just to make sure that it's solid enough that when you take it out, it's not going to deform. Because again, this is a clamshell part, so when we attach this to the other side, if it's not absolutely perfect, it's not going to fit. So we're going to have to keep it in the mold so it keeps its shape until it fully hardens. But with these thin plastic parts, it normally takes a lot longer because they're a lot weaker. All right. Now this turned out pretty nice on the outside. And here we have a few tiny bubbles right in these. These are sort of like locating holes just for the rubber piece that lies on here that has all the buttons on it. For the rest of it, it's pretty good. You have a little bit extra on there, so I'm going to drill a hole there. But for the most part, everything else looks good.